Well, I'm going to cover two areas on tonight's program. Number one, Kamala Harris. Who is she exactly? Not what the media say she is, but who is she? And number two, the media coverage of the Harris-Biden announcement and how the media is going to play a role in this campaign. First of all, let's take a quick look at her record since she's been a United States Senator. And I want you to think, as I go through this list that I made today, each and every one of these items, how radical it is and how wrenching it would be to our society. She is farther left than 97% of the Democrats in the United States Senate. She is left of avowed Marxist, democratic socialist, Bernie Sanders. She's not moderate. She's not a pragmatist like the New York Times and the others are trying to tell you. She would decriminalize illegal immigration. Decriminalize illegal immigration. She rejects a physical wall on the southern border. She compared the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Service, the men and women in federal law enforcement who, once people come here illegally, they commit crimes and other things, they try and get them and deport them. She compared them to the Ku Klux Klan. She believes in government-run health care for illegal aliens. Imagine what that will do to health care. She believes in the elimination of private health care. Many of you have private health care. Many of you have private health care through your employer or through your union. That means 160 million people would lose their health care. She is a co-sponsor with AOC of the Green New Deal. What is the Green New Deal? To put it simply, it started in Europe. It is a socialist attack on capitalism. It would affect everything from automobiles and homes, heating and air conditioning, the kind of paint you use, everything the federal government will regulate. Everything. In other words, it's a war on capitalism. She wants to attack energy independence after all these decades, where we're finally free of foreign countries and blackmail from OPEC and all the rest of it because of American ingenuity and the hard work of the American people. She wants to eventually eliminate, in short order, coal, oil, natural gas, all fossil fuels, and eliminate fracking. She wants to repeal the president's tax cuts for the middle class. She wants to massively increase taxes on all Americans. She supports infanticide, and even more, she believes you, the American taxpayer, regardless of your religion, regardless of your moral views, that you should pay for it. Abortion on demand, abortion as late as is demanded. She believes the federal government should have to approve any state law that seeks to regulate abortion in any way before a state could actually implement it. She wants to ban what are today legal firearms by executive order in clear violation of the Second Amendment. She wants massive new regulations across the board. She supports Joe Biden's war on the suburbs, Obama's war on the suburbs, where the Housing and Urban Development would basically decide all issues for the suburbs, where libraries would be, how many schools there are, whether you can have single-family homes, and on and on and on. She has said that she supports, if necessary, quote unquote, the packing of the United States Supreme Court. And she believes in eliminating the filibuster. Now, any one of these things would be destructive to our constitutional system, to our economic system, to your liberty, and to your community. Any one of these things. Does that sound like a pragmatic moderate to you, ladies and gentlemen? That sounds like the most extremist, radical politician ever to run for high office in the United States of America. It is about as clear of an un-American, anti-capitalist, anti-individual, anti-constitution agenda as one has ever stated. But what about Kamala Harris when she was district attorney? What about Kamala Harris when she was attorney general of California? What's happening is the media and the Democrats are citing that as an example to show that she's a moderate. Well, I have a man who's been tracking this for some time. His name is Mark Pulliam. He's a Law and Liberty contributing editor. He's written extensively about this, and he knows quite a bit about Kamala Harris and her role as district attorney and as Attorney General of California. Mark, how are you, sir?
I'm very well. Thanks for having me on.
Well, thanks for coming. I looked at her record. I've looked at some of what you've written, and I want you to go through it. I wouldn't say that's a record of a moderate. I would say that's a record of an autocrat and an opportunist trying to claw her way up the ladder in San Francisco and California. Can you break down some major aspects of her record back in California, please?
Sure. I think these days, in the age of the resistance, particularly among presidential aspirants in the Democratic Party, almost everybody espouses this type of hyper-progressive rhetoric. But in her case, if you go back to her track record from when she started her political career in California, you can see very disturbing signs that she really believes these things and that she has acted in the past consistently with these beliefs. She was plucked from relative obscurity as a deputy district attorney in Alameda County when Willie Brown, whom she was dating at age 29, Willie Brown being 60 and married at the time, and for the 2 years that they were in a relationship, he introduced her to the political circles that have led to her meteoric rise since then, appointed her to a couple of cushy administrative agencies positions in California that paid her over $400,000. And at the time, he was Speaker of the California Assembly, which made him really the most powerful politician in California. He was a very crafty, very savvy, very ruthless, very partisan Democrat. And she obviously learned the ropes. When, due to term limits, he was forced out as Speaker, he ran for and became mayor of San Francisco. And that's really where her political career began, when she ran for district attorney. She's only had two challenged, difficult political races. The first one was when she ran in 2003 for district attorney in San Francisco against an incumbent. Ironically, she had the support of the police officers there, because the incumbent whom she was running against had made the mistake of indicting the president of the police union and 8 of his high-level officials, and ended up getting no convictions out of that. So the police were supporting her, and she was able to defeat him. But almost immediately, she showed her true colors. There was a San Francisco police officer named Isaac Espinoza who was ambushed by a gang member, shot down in cold blood with an AK-47, and Kamala Harris, who had run with a personal opposition to the death penalty, announced 3 days after this killing, before the police officer had even been buried, that she would not seek the death penalty against the killer. And this outraged people. It outraged even the Democratic community in California, which is a one-party state. The Attorney General at the time, Bill Lockyer, disagreed with it. Dianne Feinstein disagreed with it. Dianne Feinstein was so upset, she said, I wouldn't have endorsed her for district attorney if I'd known that she would do something like this. Barbara Boxer, who was still in the Senate at the time, disagreed with it and said that she disagreed with it so much she was urging the federal prosecutors to prosecute this gang member under federal law. And the police union, needless to say, was aghast. So this is the kind of prosecutor that she is, one who has such contempt for law enforcement that she would refuse to seek the death penalty for a cop killer. And this wasn't an isolated example. 5 years later, she did the same thing in San Francisco. A MS-13 illegal alien murdered a father and his 2 sons who were returning from a picnic, and she announced that she wasn't going to seek the death penalty against them either. However, once she got in as district attorney, the machine politics took over, and she was reelected in that position without any opposition. But clearly her sights were on higher office, and in 2010 she ran for Attorney General.
Let me ask you another question about her DA position. There's also, as I read, a case involving the molestation of several individuals by certain priests in the jurisdiction there. Do you want to fill us in about that?
Well, this is a controversy about something she didn't do. This is while in many jurisdictions priests were being prosecuted for molestation. There were active cases that her predecessor, Terrence Hallinan, had begun, but none of those were prosecuted during the time that she was district attorney in San Francisco. So this is a matter of setting her priorities, and going after priests was not part of that priority, perhaps because some of these churches were where these priests were associated with this political establishment in San Francisco. This is the city of Nancy Pelosi and other people who profess to be Catholics, and she didn't want to step on toes. This is Willie Brown 101. You reward your friends and you punish your enemies.
Yeah, because I saw one of the gentlemen who was a very young kid who was brutally raped repeatedly by two priests. The district attorney who she defeated, the incumbent, was gathering all the documentation and was prepared to bring some major charges. And he has since said that she refused to bring charges. She refused to talk to him directly. And they basically got rid of the documentation and nothing came of it.
And the hypocrisy is she claims that as a prosecutor in initially Alameda County and then later in San Francisco, that her emphasis was on helping victims of child abuse. But we see that when she actually had the power to do something, she didn't.
Well, in that case, she definitely took a pass, and you might even say it was a cover-up. I'm sure the New York Times and the Washington Post will get right on top of that. When we come back, I'm going to take a look at her record as Attorney General of the state of California. We'll be right back.
I have the power to lower my blood sugar and A1C.
Welcome back. Kamala Harris, this is your life. Not the spin and the narrative of the New York Times and the Washington Post, but your actual record. As Attorney General of the state of California, Mark Pulliam, who is the contributing editor for Law and Liberty. Mark, well, tell us about some of her actions or non-actions as Attorney General of California.
In 2016, I wrote a long article for City Journal, which was a profile of Kamala Harris while she was running for the Senate, but before she got elected. And I looked at a number of her things that she did and didn't do when she was Attorney General. And some of the most controversial things that she did, and the things that I think are most indicative of her true character, are, for instance, she refused to defend Proposition 8 on appeal. Proposition 8 was a California initiative that had declared marriage to be a union of one man and one woman. And following the lead of her predecessor as Attorney General, Jerry Brown, she refused to defend this state law contrary to her oath on appeal, and lo and behold, this initiative was forced to be defended by its proponents, and they defended it. When it got to the U.S. Supreme Court, the U.S. Supreme Court said that the proponents did not have legal standing to defend it, and that therefore the appeal was invalid, and sent it back, where, of course, Prop 8 lost because Vaughn Walker, a biased judge in San Francisco, had ruled against it. So Kamala Harris, by her refusal to defend a state law, sabotaged the will of the people, which is, I think, a tremendous violation of her oath. Another thing that she did as Attorney General, she was responsible for crafting the language of ballot measures. And in California, we have a lot of initiatives. And this is how people are able to get things on the ballot and enact laws. But she's the gatekeeper. She's the one that decides how the ballot summary will read. And she used her power as the gatekeeper to distort laws, so that laws that would, let's say, restrict the power and influence of public employee unions were calculated to fail. But laws or initiatives that were being sponsored by trial lawyers, which were an ally of the Democratic Party, she would do everything she could, including deceptive characterizations of what the initiative was about, to try to make those pass. Fortunately, one example where the trial lawyers were trying to trying to have a cap removed on non-economic damages and medical malpractice, that initiative failed, even though she falsely characterized it. Another thing she did as Attorney General, she had the power to approve the sales of nonprofit assets. And as she was approaching her bid for the Senate, and she desperately needed the endorsements of public employee unions, she held the sale of a financially distressed chain of hospitals hostage, because even though this hospitals chain was losing $10 million a month and desperately needed to take measures to turn it around, the unions representing the employees did not want any changes, and they got Kamala Harris to impose 300 conditions that the buyer of this hospital chain would be required to adopt as a condition of sale, even though they were willing to pay $843 million for this chain of hospitals. And as a result of this high-handed conditions that she imposed, the sale faltered. So she has shown herself as Attorney General to be basically an agent for the special interests, and she has used everything at her disposal to reward friends and punish enemies. It is not the track record of a moderate, and certainly not even the track record of an honorable prosecutor. She is supposed to be the chief law enforcement officer of the state of California, and yet she was very reluctant to defend the death penalty when a federal judge declared it unconstitutional. She is no friend of the police. She imposed implicit bias training on police in California, one of the first states to do so. She has been a tremendous disappointment. There was a ballot measure that was opposed by every law enforcement agency in California and virtually all of the county district attorneys that would have retroactively revised many felonies and turned them into misdemeanors, which would have the effect of letting thousands of convicted felons out of prison. This initiative was opposed, and she refused to take a position. And even though she had the bully pulpit and could have turned it around, this initiative unfortunately passed, and thousands of criminals were released, and the crime rate went up. She was a disaster.
She also went after the nonprofit organization that exposed Planned Parenthood and what Planned Parenthood was doing with the harvesting and selling of baby body parts. And she also joined with the most leftist of the Democrat attorneys general in the country to go after Exxon with bogus claims against Exxon, claiming that their press releases and other opposition to the notion of climate change, quote unquote, was deceiving to the public, deceiving to investors, and therefore a criminal act and a criminal enterprise. The point being, as you point out, and there's even plenty more information, she used her position as Attorney General of California in the most political way possible, to reward her friends, to punish her enemies, to advance a political agenda in so many respects. And then we have the case where she was prosecuting marijuana violations, relatively minor marijuana violations, and then she's interviewed a year or so ago while she's running for president. She laughs over the fact that she used marijuana. She went after parents, truants, and sometimes you have tough kids, and sometimes parents, as much as they may try to control a 17-year-old or a 16-year-old who's going to high school and so forth, she was charging them to try and put them in jail too, and making lots of great headlines and so forth. So I think the picture you paint, and the picture her record paints, is not of somebody who has a good temperament, somebody who was a straight shooter. It's somebody who abused her power and used her office as Attorney General of California with honey and with a stick, and always in mind for her next position in office. And I think we see that as the 2 years in the Senate, where she's embraced every radical kook idea as a co-sponsor, as a promoter, where she has been enormously vicious, an absolute Spiro Agnew-type character assassin when it comes to Kavanaugh. I think we're going to see that also when it comes to the President of the United States, that Biden will pretty much be in his basement, and she'll be out there as the attack dog. Mark Pulliam, I want to thank you, contributing editor of Law and Liberty. Keep up the good work. Keep informing the American people about what you know about Kamala Harris. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mark.
We'll be right back. Welcome back. Now let's look at the fantastic news coverage. Let's just pick two from from the New York Times is a perfect example. Look at this. Isn't that fantastic? I wonder if Kamala Harris gave her that portrait so they could put it on the first page. Headline, Harris joins Biden ticket, achieving a first. Now keep in mind, Harris was rejected by the Democrat Party soundly. Wasn't even close. The voters in the Democrat primaries didn't even have a chance to vote for or against her because she was at 2%. So the party that rejected her and is giving the nomination to Joe Biden is achieving a first. It's a historic first. But she didn't want to be vice president. She wanted to be president. But it's a historic first. Then the headlines under it, political warrior shaped by life inside system. Next headline, fresh approach to a tradition. Next one, woman of color in number 2 slot of major party. Can you imagine this kind of reporting for a Republican of any kind? I mean, it's unbelievable. Then we had the Washington Post the same day. Here, let's hold that one up too. Isn't that magnificent? Right across the head, like the landing on the moon. It says here, in historic move, Biden selects Harris for VP. Subheadlines, black woman express overwhelming level of joy. Senator is first black woman to run on major party ticket. Again, it's the same party that denied her the top of the ticket, resoundingly. Then the next day, the New York Times headlines, Biden and Harris vow to revive U.S. as Trump attacks. GOP falls back on pattern of insults. Wow. First taste of clash between tickets. Okay, New York Times, the Democrat Party Bible, and the Washington Post. Biden and Harris come out swinging. Wow. Unbelievable. Joe Concha is the man that I wanted to talk to about this. He's the media reporter for the Hill newspaper. Joe, very objective, I thought, the New York Times and the Washington Post, AP, ABC, all the rest. What do you think?
Well, that wasn't even the half of it, Mark. You also had, as if a memo went out, basically declaring, we're going to make sure that Kamala Harris is portrayed as a moderate, or as the New York Times called it, a pragmatic moderate, as a centrist. Drive that point home seemed to be the message. The Associated Press, quote, in adding Harris to the ticket, he could point to her relatively centrist record on issues such as health care and her background in law enforcement. Okay, let's look at just those two things if we're going to look at the Associated Press in terms of the way they're portraying Kamala Harris. She wants to provide health care for the undocumented. Remember, during a debate, she and everybody else raised their hands when asked that question. She also supports Medicare for all. So is that a centrist position on health care? Don't think so. And then finally, we talk about, in terms of her career in law enforcement, as you spoke in the first half hour of the show. If you remember, during the Brett Kavanaugh hearings, this was really incredible. The New York Times reported, then retracted sexual assault claims against Kavanaugh, not the original ones, but other ones that came out, which were utterly ridiculous. And when Kamala Harris was asked about that, she said, well, he should have to prove they didn't happen. Is that the way law enforcement works, particularly when you're the Attorney General of the largest state in the country? I don't think so. So then the Los Angeles Times also says, picking Harris, Biden puts centrist stamp on Democrats' future. Okay, let's look at the centrist positions that she's taken. And first, actually, let's talk about GovTrack. If you're familiar with them, they look at strictly legislation or co-sponsored legislation for each senator in the country. You know where Kamala Harris ranked among all senators in that context? Last, behind Bernie Sanders. In other words, she is the most liberal senator in the United States Senate based on her record in the United States Senate. That is not my opinion. So look, she supports banning fracking. She supports the Green New Deal, which means trillions in new taxes. So I could go down the line in terms of if Kamala Harris is a moderate, as the media is portraying her to be, or if she is the most liberal senator in the U.S. Senate, and it appears that it's the latter at this point, yet that's the portrayal that we're seeing. This is not a pragmatic moderate. This is somebody who's not pragmatic nor moderate, and it's probably the last person you want to put on ticket if you are Joe Biden and you want to unite the country, and in the process, the press going forward in terms of her coverage or their coverage of Kamala Harris will be the exact opposite of what we saw 12 years ago, Mark, with Sarah Palin in 2008.
It is an amazing thing. You know, there have been a lot of historic firsts, but when Republicans are historic firsts, they're attacked. But I want to reiterate a point. There were many people running for the Democrat Party nomination. She was one of them. She got really no traction whatsoever. The party establishment fought her. James Clyburn, the number 3 Democrat in the House, an African American, opposed her in South Carolina and helped Biden take the nomination. So when the Democrat Party machinery had an opportunity to get behind a historic first, it got behind an historic blah, which is Joe Biden, 3rd time running for President of the United States. But I want to discuss this a little bit more broadly with you. We have Joe Biden, who's really running a preposterous campaign. The idea that he can't be more public. When I go to a grocery store, when I go to a restaurant, and everybody else is managing this pandemic in their own lives, in their own way, with the social distancing and the mask, the idea that Joe Biden refuses to conduct himself like a regular American, in other words, at least do something. They attacked Trump for playing golf. Man, I'd give 5 stars if Joe Biden would go out and play golf or do something like that. My question to you when we return, Joe Concha, she's going to be the attack dog out there, isn't she? She's going to be the Democrat equivalent of Spiro Agnew, isn't she? That's my question to you when we return. We'll be right back. Welcome back. So my premise is that the historic Kamala Harris is going to be much like Spiro Agnew in the sense that she's going to be out there doing the attack job. She did it on Kavanaugh. She did it on Biden, for that matter. She doesn't seem to have a problem with it. What's your take on this, Joe?
Well, I think invariably vice presidential candidates do become attack dogs. I'm not so sure that Mike Pence was in 2016 necessarily. But yes, if Joe Biden has done something like 2 press conferences in 140 days. This is the person that wants to be the 46th president of the United States. And while safe spaces used to be just confined to college campuses, now it appears to apply to Democratic presidential candidates as well, because this is somebody that when he even does take questions, they're hardly what you would call tough. It's not even softball. It's basically t-ball when you put a beach ball on the t-ball in terms of the interviews that Joe Biden has done. And you could talk about President Trump in terms of, okay, is he accessible to the press? Yes, he is is the most accessible president, has taken more questions from the press than any president in history, and he's not even out of year 3 yet. So what are we talking about here? Year 4, excuse me. So Joe Biden, I think, is trying to do the Hillary Clinton approach here, Mark, where it's a matter of playing 4 corners, to use a basketball term, run out the clock, get to the election day without having to face any scrutiny whatsoever, because he feels it's working to this point. But we're only in August, and after Labor Day, people start paying attention to this race. It's already tightening, and it's all going to come down to, I'm afraid, Mark, because Joe Biden isn't going to put himself out there to do anything resembling a tough interview. Those 3 presidential debates that'll be happening in about, well, we're getting pretty close to it, about 8 weeks, and it is essential that the moderators that are chosen are actually objective, tough, fair questioners that will ask Joe Biden about his positions on things like, what do you think about what's going on in major cities such as Portland, Seattle, Minneapolis, Atlanta, New York, in terms of the crime rates going through the roof, shootings and murders out of control, mayors not able to control their own cities? What would you do if you were president? Hey, you support the Green New Deal, as does your vice presidential candidate. That means trillions in new taxes, and not just on the rich. You're going to have to tax all tax brackets. How do you do that? How do you pay for all these things that you want to pay for coming out of a pandemic where we spent more money than we ever have as a country? So if the economic aspect of this, the law and order aspect of this campaign is actually broached during these debates, I think that will be a telling moment for Mr. Biden, because he hasn't been asked about it at this point. And Kamala Harris, if she's going to be out there more, you would think that she'll take some questions. Hopefully we have some journalists left that ask questions about the things that matter most to the American people. They want to hear what these guys have to say in terms of Harris and Biden, and not just Donald Trump is bad, elect us because we're better people.
You know, it's interesting when you watched them together. You know, they're both tested to make sure neither of them has the virus, and yet they're still distancing. I mean, they're tested like 15 minutes before they go on stage, but they create this impression that they're following the rules, when in fact, they're tested. They don't have the virus. They could have actually hugged each other. But that aside, a couple of things here. Number one, they don't have an answer to the violence in the streets. Number two, they're not condemning the violence in the streets. Number three, Kamala Harris embraced Black Lives Matter the other day. Black Lives Matter is an anti-Semitic, anti-American, Marxist organization. Number four, she trashed the cops. This doesn't sound moderate to me. And number 5, on the pandemic, the president is mishandling the pandemic. Joe Biden hasn't proposed a single idea different than what the president of the United States has done because he's following the science, and yet they're blaming him for the pandemic. And so I looked at the statistics, and the statistics show that in terms of deaths per million, the top 10 states, 9 of them are controlled by Democrat governors. 9 of the top 10 states with the most deaths per million are controlled by Democrat governors, and by far the number 1 state is New York, and by far the number 2 state is New Jersey. The governors are in charge on the ground, the chief executives, many of them like little dictators in their own rights, of how they're handling life and death issues. The President of the United States is filling gaps. The President of the United States is trying to give them the finances, the ventilators, the hospital beds, the expertise. But in the end, it's the governors. And Cuomo used to say, we believe in federalism. I'm in charge. So when Kamala Harris and Biden try and blame the President of the United States for deaths as a result of the coronavirus, which he had no control over in the first instance, do you think that's going to fly with the American people?
I would think it shouldn't, because if we had an honest press, they would be pressing Andrew Cuomo, governor of New York, about his decision, that executive order in March, to put COVID-positive patients back into nursing homes. That's like taking a flamethrower to dry grass. And now we're starting to hear that the death toll could be even twice of what we think it is already, which is somewhere in the 6,000 to 7,000 range. Cuomo's not going to be asked about that in any way. And obviously, then therefore, Biden and Harris escape scrutiny. And particularly with Kamala Harris, there's a women's group, Mark, that put out a warning earlier this week. And this women's group is run by allies of the Clintons and the Obamas, or former officials in those particular camps or administrations. And they said, if you go after Kamala Harris too much, and you really scrutinize whether it be her record, whether it be her qualifications, whether it be her past actions, you know, they don't say that explicitly, but they say, you know what, stay away from Kamala Harris. You go after her too much, you're going to be branded a sexist, or you're going to be branded a racist. And a lot of journalists out there, probably in cancel culture, what happened to an editor at the New York Times, because he actually printed a op-ed from Tom Cotton advocating the use of the military when violence and protests get out of control, a position that a majority of the people actually supported if you looked at polling at the time. That guy got eliminated from his position. There was a sportscaster in Sacramento who said on Twitter, when asked about Black Lives Matter, he said, you know what, I think all lives matter. He got fired from his position, not even reprimanded like, hey, keep the political stuff out. He's gone.
Excellent points. We'll be right back. Welcome back. Joe, we hear that kind of word's been put out that you can criticize Kamala Harris to a point, but she's a historic figure, so you better not go too far. You can call Trump Hitler, but you better be very careful when it comes to Kamala. Have you heard about this?
Earlier in the week, Mark, there was actually a women's group that's led by former allies of Hillary Clinton or former officials in the Obama administration saying that if you criticize Kamala Harris a little bit too hard, then we have a war room. They actually declared this, a war room to hit back against false smears or anything deemed sexist or racist against Kamala Harris. And that's the scary thing, right? Because now that sounds like a threat. And I look at this one Cato Institute poll that came out also earlier this week that said that 62% of adults in the United States are afraid to express their political views because they're afraid of cancel culture. In other words, if they say something maybe on Facebook, maybe around the office, if we ever get back to an office, but if they ever say anything that is deemed to be insensitive, like Donald Trump is my president, as what happened in Michigan with one teacher there. He declared it on Facebook, and he was fired for saying it. This is something that I think now journalists may be thinking about as well, that, well, if I criticize Kamala Harris in terms of her past actions or her votes or things that she may have said, I may be deemed a sexist or a racist or both, and that could be my job. So I better go easy on her. And these were people that, many of them anyway, were probably thinking of going easy on her already. So, yeah, when you have a women's group saying, we have a war room watching every question being asked of Kamala Harris and every analysis being made, boy, that's Orwellian, to say the least, Mark.
Were these ladies concerned when Sarah Palin was brutalized by the Democrat Party, by some in the Republican Party, and by the media? Did they pull their little war room together then and accuse people of being misogynists?
there was more of a war room against Palin, right? And I looked at some old surveys from the 2008 election, and a survey of stories shown on NBC, CBS, ABC from September 29th, October 12th of 2012 showed that negative stories about Palin were shown over positive stories at a rate of 18 to 1. Do you think that's going to happen with Kamala Harris? I don't think so. I think it's going to be more 18 to 1 positive to negative in this situation, because it's a matter of you help out the vice presidential candidate. The presidential candidate is largely absent from any sort of media scrutiny or doing any interviews, and you push them over the finish line in defeating Donald Trump. But let me leave you with this, Mark. When Donald Trump leaves the stage, it's kind of like if J.R. Ewing was taken off of Dallas, or Tony Soprano was taken off The Sopranos, or, I don't know, Kevin Spacey was taken off of House of Cards. You take the protagonist that you focused on for the last 4 years off the stage, and then you're going to see ratings, and you could save the tape on this if you like, ratings crashes of 80, 90% on cable news, the cable news networks at least, that dedicate all their time to attacking the president and not simply reporting on him. And I'm not saying you can't ask tough questions and analyze his record, but obviously we've seen what's been going on some other networks and the newspapers as well that have taken these positions. They will struggle mightily, if not just go out of business altogether, when Donald Trump does leave the stage, whether that happens in 2021 or 2025.
Well, they believe in evolution. That's called evolution, I suppose. Did Sarah Palin get a cover like this from the New York Times? A historic first of a beautiful photo and all the rest. Is that how the New York Times treated Sarah Palin? I don't believe so.
Sarah Palin was probably treated as bad as any politician in history.
That's true. Joe Conch, I want to thank you very, very much. God bless you and take care of yourself.
Thanks, Mark. Have a good one.
We'll be right back.